Good afternoon. This is Muslim Network TV, and I am Professor Al-Deen with Critical Talk. I have tried to avoid politics, but no matter where I run, there seems to be no place to hide. As you can see behind me, I'm pulling down articles and trying to keep up, but it's a little overwhelming. So I thought I would go back to our political science correspondent, Professor Scott Hibbard, who is an associate professor and chair of political science at DePaul University, and a really good friend of mine who can't go skiing today in Chicago because although we have snow, we don't have quite enough, and there's no blizzard. And I thought we would give our beginning look before we do a 100-day look at what the hell is going on. So I would like to begin our conversation. And hey, Scott, how you doing?
Nice to see you, Amina.
Yeah, um, with a little clip that we are using from Vice TV on where we're going to begin, which is the end of Trump. And then the second half of the show, we're going to do on the beginning of Biden. And although most of you in the viewing audience have seen all of this before, we're going to pay it some special attention. So, can I have the clip, please?
Soon after, the mob was rampaging through the halls of the Capitol. From what we saw on Wednesday, the MAGA anger is at a new level. And with Trump now banned from Twitter and plans already circulating for future marches on the Capitol, that day of unprecedented violence may not be the end of this unrest.
Now, when we look at that, there have been lots of complaints, a little bit of analysis about what is really going on here. We had in May Black Lives Matter. Thousands of people across the world pouring out in the aftermath of a very haunting, scary visual of the murder of George Floyd, with a police officer literally posing as he killed someone. And I want to take a little brief thing. I see my other buddy in crime, Khalil Marrar, professor at Governor State in political science, who has decided to come in black and white. Now, I don't know if that's a political statement or not.
It is.
It is? All right. Is your butt in jail or what? I'm just messing.
I just think it looks better for the new age, you know?
Okay. That's interesting. I will come back to that point. So we looked at a little clip from Vice TV on the insurrection on January 6th. And there seemed to be different, I don't want to call them categories, but different ways of talking about it. When we looked at Black Lives Matter, people poured out in the streets in cities and towns across America, followed by people pouring out in the streets across Europe and on the African continent and all the way to Japan. One of the things all of those things had in common was in many of these states across our global union, police are out of control and have become an arm of the government to suppress, keep in power, do all of those good, interesting things. But in this taking over, so to speak, of our nation's capital, I thought we could, and it's always helpful this is not the first time we've had an insurrection. We also have one of those uh, politicians way back when talking about revolution every now and then is good. It cleanses the palate. We've had notions of, in our Constitution and other documents, the fact that we need to, in essence, surveil our government. And when it gets off track, move to correct it. Now, that also flies in the face of things like rights, uh, substantive and procedural. It flies in the face of how we understand pluralism. And I think that we're not only an experiment in democracy, we're also an experiment in pluralism and how we keep institutional integrity on one hand, institutional sovereignty on the other, but hold both accountable to the people themselves. So after I've given my little spiel, and that's all I know about the subject, let's go again to the last days of Trump. What are your thoughts on what's going on?
Okay, well, I'll start off this. I think there's kind of three big issues when you look at January 6th. The first is it didn't just start with January 6th.
Right.
It really started with the big lie that was promoted by the president that this election was stolen, and and amplified by the right-wing media
And the left wing, because the left wing carried it too.
Yeah, but there were those that supporters of Trump that echoed it and amplified it.
Yeah.
And that's really what activated, the people that were arguing that the election was stolen. They were protesting these, what they call "Stop the Steal." But the thing is that that unfolded throughout December. But all this had been preceded by armed protests outside of the state capitol in Lansing, Michigan, and other places. Mm. And so you saw this through the election cycle, through the post-election process. This activation of kind of an aggrieved right-wing constituency, and then it was heightened, and to use Liz Cheney's phrase, those that community was summoned, incited, and unleashed by the president at an event down outside the White House, outside the Ellipse. And so that is what's that's the big issue of what's going on. The third point that I'll just make about this is that what struck most people, and I think this is what you were getting at, Amina, was the police response both before and after, or both before, during, and after, was markedly different than the Black Lives Matters protest. The Capitol Hill police, did not call in the National Guard ahead of time. I guess now it's coming out that there was an effort to declare a state of emergency that was overruled, and much of this was overruled by people who thought that this looked bad. That these are kind of our people, white, middle class, whatever, and so there was so they were clearly not prepared for it. But then even during, the response by the police to the protesters was markedly different than if their skin had been brown or black, or their name was Ahmed or whatever. You would have seen a very, very different response. And I think now that at least people in DC are grappling with that.
Well, I also saw the white underclass in movement, aided and abetted by the middle class and the upper class, kind of blurring their own boundaries, which they would normally keep remarkably clear. But piggybacking off of a kind of groundswell of angst. But I think it's important, just for our unbiased kind of analysis, what were the actual grievances? Of course, you're aggrieved when you lose something you wanted to win. But what were the actual grievances that they thought that a Trump win would bring to them that 4 years of Trump had not brought?
Well, very quickly, and I'll turn it over to Khalil. There is a sense within kind of the right wing of America that secularism and immigration and other issues like that are undermining the integrity of their vision of what the nation is. And from their perspective, and again, this is a byproduct also of a closed information ecosystem or media ecosystem.
Right.
And they have this vision of what their society is losing, or it's losing track, it's losing sight of God. Their kids aren't learning respect. And so they're rebelling against that. And again, and part of this is also tied up with economic dislocation associated with, the neoliberal economic policies of recent years. And so you kind of tie that up into a bundle, and Trump, I would argue, is very manipulative in activating that base. But those are kind of the grievances. I mean, many of them are cultural, but there's also an underlying, at least for a certain segment, there's also an underlying economic issue. And of course, there's also religious overtones to all of this.
Khalil?
Yeah.
Khalil?
I think Scott, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I think Professor Hibbard hit on a very good point, that this location aspect, it's economic, it's cultural, and Donald Trump convinced him that it was also political. And the storming of the Capitol, you're absolutely right, Amina, it's not unprecedented. It has many precedents, with Shays' Rebellion being the first example in the history of the United States that we know of anyway, that recorded the celebrated and the maligned history of the United States of America. And that's why we have a constitution. I think ultimately, though, we have to go back to the post or pre-election, rather, show that we did together. And, I don't want to sound Pollyanna, but the system worked. It's working right now. And you're right, Amina, that this is not without its precedence, but more importantly, it's also the result of these forces that Professor Hibbard's talking about so succinctly.
Well,
if I can follow up on, sorry, Emma, can I follow up on that for 1 second? Sure. I think Khalil's point is really important, that the institutions held that, and this is one of my concerns, is that, if it weren't for the governor of Georgia and the secretary of Georgia and the state legislature in Pennsylvania,
right,
and and the leadership within the Department of Justice, things could have gone terribly awry. But all of those people stood up and put institutions, their loyalty to the institutions ahead of their loyalty to their party. And the great concern is, that might not happen, in a future time.
Well, let me just say this, because here we are, and I don't want to classify us either, but let me say we are a little more even and reasoned. But our governance is supposed to listen to all of the voices. It is not supposed to listen to some and not others, or we're headed for more insurrection, right? And on the other hand, granted, the institutions held in spite of, right? But if those institutions do not find a way to mediate all of the voices that are speaking out, I mean, poor white folks, poor black folks, poor brown folks, all suffered from poverty in the marketplace of both ideas, healthcare, economics, housing, etc. Although much was made of their color differences and perhaps their uh, ethnic differences, they're still all suffering from poverty. The person that lives in the trailer camp is no better off than the person that lives in a neglected part of the south side of Chicago, right? And their ability to access healthcare is greatly diminished across the board. And I'm thinking both of you know much more than I do about specific places in the Middle East. If you had a situation, and we've seen it, Egypt and other places, where a part of the population is not listened to and they can't get bread, which is our equivalent of we can't get bread or health care, then you have a blow up. How do we get good governance?
Khalil, you want to take that one?
No, I really don't. But I will say this: Dr. McLeod asks a very important question: how do we get good governance? And the answer is, as Churchill said, it's the least bad form of government. Democracy is.
How would Churchill know? He couldn't even tie his shoes. Well, go ahead.
I want to say this. So, as academics, whoever we are, right? We're not exactly mainstream. We're sort of elite. But if I was to sort of tap into the mainstream for just a second, understanding the dangers that Donald Trump has sort of like set up, if you will, before me and many before him as well. He's not the first populist in American history, or in any history. But if I can get into the mainstream for just a second, I think there's a very bona fide grievance that the support for Donald Trump sort of brings out in the American body politic, in the American socioeconomic political milieu, as both of you are very aptly pointing out. I'm not going to really touch that one as much as I'll say this, that there's not only dislocation, cultural, economic, health, even health, right, is an unequal enterprise. There's also dislocation in terms of, as an immigrant person myself, we came here in 1987. I look at this country, I don't know what country I'm in anymore. And I'm talking about this before the storming of the Capitol.
Yeah.
I'm talking about it before the COVID crisis. I'm talking about it before the economic downturn. And by that, I mean that the change has brought about a country that I really don't recognize, but it's not change as a force of history. It's the change that both of you are pointing to very clearly, and that is the change of what we used to call the echo chamber, which still is very pertinent today, the rabbit hole of social networking, and frankly, the rabbit hole of ideology that's always been around. It's just now it's given a much more useful instrument in social media and the internet more broadly for echoing louder and louder and creating more of a rabbit hole into which we all descend in some respects.
And see if I can follow up on that. Get back to your original question. I'm glad you mentioned the Arab Uprisings, because that was 10 years ago, right? With the anniversary of the uprisings in Egypt were 10 years ago, January 25th. And I look at the Trump administration as very similar to the Mubarak administration or Mubarak regime, in that Trump but hear me out. He really had no interest in governing.
Yeah,
he had been interested in gaining power, right, and using that power to enrich himself and his friends. And that's essentially what the Mubarak people did. I mean, they had no interest in actually developing the society. It was really using the levers of power to enrich themselves and their friends and their constituencies, the military, what have you. And it gets to a point where the population is so disenfranchised that they do rise up. Getting back to your question then, like, how does that change? Well, in some respects, it changes, through, at least in our society, with the new administration. But no one will take the new administration seriously if it can't deliver on its, on what the needs of the population are. And so, in some respects, the key for Biden to succeed is just to deliver on, healthcare, COVID vaccination, economic renewal, all these things that he campaigned on, and that in the first whatever week and a half that he's been in, he's already beginning to deliver on some of these issues. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not he can actually implement this agenda, or whether you'll see a replay of what happened in the Biden or in the Obama era, where a Republican Senate really stymies the kinds of legislative reforms and even just the economic relief packages that are necessary. And so government is perceived by the population as not being able to address their needs. And if Biden can overcome that, then I think what you'll see is is greater faith in government and a return to good governance. Well,
how do we, if we were to look at some of the things that would be complained about, we seem to have returned to an era of suppress the vote, extreme gerrymandering. How did we get back there?
Part of it is that the Republican Party is increasingly becoming a minority party. In that,
Oh,
I mean, just it doesn't. I mean, they do not have enough. They do not have enough people supporting them to actually win a popular vote nationwide. So they rely upon the institutions like the Electoral College to deliver them, control of the presidency. They rely upon gerrymandering to gain control of the House of Representatives, and they rely upon these antiquated institutions like the Senate to maintain control of the Senate. So they're a minority party, and so how do you stay in power? But by disenfranchising the vote, gerrymandering, and it's not that Democrats don't do the gerrymandering as well, but I think what you find is that the Republicans have made it an art form, and they've also been the ones that have been consciously involved in voter suppression, which you don't see on the Democratic side.
so before we go to break, I just gotta ask for my audience, but also mostly for myself. How does one man named Mr. McConnell, I have other names for him, but I'll stick with his real name, um, get to determine what goes forth and what doesn't? What gets voted on and what doesn't? Is he president? Really?
Well, now you're going to have a new majority leader in the Senate, but
Who's the majority leader?
Chuck Schumer. So the Senate is now in Democratic hands, but it's an institutional anomaly, right? This is the way the institution is set up. The majority party controls what gets on the Senate floor. They control, to use a political science term, they are in charge of agenda setting. So they determine what actually gets to be considered and debated. And these are the parliamentary rules that we set up, ages ago. And the question remains whether or not they're still relevant or whether or not they should be changed.
So one of the things we can say is that more so than perhaps past presidencies, the Trump presidency alerted us to all the darn crevices, valleys, gaps, need to be rethoughts. How do we? Short of a constitutional, what do they call it? One of those constitutional parties where you go back and do it again.
Constitutional Convention.
There you go.
Yeah.
Constitutional Convention. How are we? Because many of the gaps people had never thought about. They were buried back there in books, have come to fore. And as you two dudes teach students, how has your teaching changed to now talk about not what should be there, but what we didn't get right and where the gaps are? Because you can't be teaching the same old syllabus anymore.
Yeah. Khalil, your thoughts?
I mean, you two are, my head's going to explode listening to all the things that you're raising in it. It's literally like, listen, Eminem makes a good point, and that is, how the heck did Mitch McConnell get away with acting as if he runs the show? That's an important question.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party has become the party of don't ditch Mitch. Frankly, they're very loyal to that top leadership as well as the Democratic Party. I don't blame them for doing that. Listen, that's point number one, is that there's a cult of personality on all sides, Donald Trump being the best exemplary. But you're right, Amina, Dr. McLeod, is that Mitch McConnell does have a base within the Republican Party that really allows him to get away with maybe not shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue like Donald Trump, but a whole lot, right? That's point number one. Point number two is to your second. How have we changed our teaching? Well, besides the Zooming and the phoning and the conference calling and all that stuff that we're doing right now, asynchronous and synchronous, I don't want to sound weird, but I haven't really changed my teaching all that much. And the reason for that is because if I'm going to apply the standard that you're both pointing to earlier from the Arab Spring or from the Muslim world at large, right? I will say that one standard is good enough for all of us. And here it is. Those folks that stormed the Capitol are representing some very interesting, some would even say legitimate interests. They're not just blind followers of Donald Trump. That is not to say that they weren't egged on and incited literally into insurrection by Donald Trump. What I'm saying, however, is that we have to pay attention to the underlying issues. In my craft, and Professor Hibbard's, we used to call it the root causes of terrorism. What are the root causes of the angst that forces people to feel the kind of anxiety that produces the March on Washington? And this is a March on Washington, but it's no longer the British redcoats. It's now the insurrectionists, right?
Or
And
Martin Luther King.
right.
Or, yeah.
The one thing I will add is, and this has been kind of a challenge, because on the one hand, at least in my classes, look, politics is about debates, and you really, going back to Khalil's point, you really want to make sure that everyone understands, both sides of an argument, or the multiple sides of an argument, that, you shouldn't walk out of a class only hearing one side, you should hear multiple sides. What's really been a challenge in the last 4 years in particular is the element of lack of truth, right? There's not that many of these arguments are not rooted in empirically, or in an empirical reality, that there is this QAnon phenomenon, which is really just conspiracy theories, made up out of whole cloth. And, students are exposed to that. And so part of what I've really tried to do is to separate, out legitimate arguments from, the fantastical, and, try to get the students back to, empirical reality. And again, you can have differing opinions on it, but, what was the comment Winston Churchill said? You're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your facts. And so that's one of the things that I've really tried to do in my classes, to kind of bring it back to, a factual basis.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break. I want both of you to look at Biden's first 25 executive orders. And I want to talk a little bit about, you can sign an executive order and it might take 100 years to get it in place. But to talk about them in a way that is candid, what is doable, what is front showing, what is, I want to make you feel good. And we'll be right back. This is Professor Al-Deen, and I'm here with my two favorite political scientists, Scott Hibbard and Khalil Marrar, and we're talking about the end of Trump and the beginning of Biden, and this is Muslim Network TV on Critical Talk. We'll be right back.
Billboards are popping up all over the country with an...
Our neighbors don't realize that Muslims are absolutely opposed to ISIS.
Salam. My name is Abdul Malik Mujahid. I'm an imam in Chicago.
16 shots! No peace! No justice! No peace!
So how do we bring up the energy which can really have an impact on the world? You need to build bridges of understanding among people, and we need to have America moving forward.
That lesson learned has brought the strength of humanity to America, which is the diversity.
Mujahid Talks, only on Muslim Network TV. Faithfully connected.
Boy, it's so funny when I look at you all's pictures up on the promo. You all are just happy. Don't have a care in the world. Now I see lines and wrinkles and deepening dimples and all this other good stuff. Okay.
You're younger.
Hibbard, you're always youthful, as are you, Professor Amina.
Yeah. Let's look at this list. Now, he's been aggressive. But as you look down this list, let's categorize it. How would you, Khalil, categorize it? Some of this, and I don't see a bunch of stuff about foreign policy, although there might be something in here.
There's a couple by my count, like that could apply that way. But it's 100%, you're right, it's 100% undo Trump,
Yeah. Is that wise?
Well, okay. So two things. One is, it's difficult to get stuff through legislative process. And so what's ended up happening over the last, 3 administrations is an increased reliance on executive orders. And executive orders are basically just directives to the federal bureaucracy to provide guidance on how to implement laws. And the problem with the executive order is, the next president comes in and he writes an executive order, undoing the earlier executive order.
Right.
And so some of the stuff is actually, very straightforward, and he'd been set on the campaign trail and very easily done. Rejoining the Paris Agreement.
Is it easy to rejoin?
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, it's not. I mean, nothing's easy, but in terms of demonstrating a commitment to rejoin, yeah, that's easy.
Okay, but they have to. There's a process, right?
Right.
And it was going to expire actually right before Trump's term ended. So it's not that the United States was ever really in violation, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's more of a norms regime rather than international law. But it's an accord, right? It's an agreement. But yeah, we were threatening to bow out of it. And it's not easy to reverse the damage that the threats have made to the world environment, to the global environment in which we existed pre-Trump.
Yeah, but there's some things that he's done in the last, well, not in the first day, but in some subsequent days that are actually really important. Like one was rejoining the WHO and re-engaging with the
Trump out of there too.
Yeah, so Trump pulled us out of the World Health Organization and directed the federal agencies to stop cooperating with the WHO
in the middle of a pandemic.
What's that?
In the middle of a pandemic.
In the middle of a pandemic,
yeah, right.
And so one of the first things that the Biden administration does is like, okay, we're now going to re-engage and we're going to work on that. And similarly, I think this just happened yesterday. Biden's signed a executive order to reopen the Obamacare health exchanges, which expired in December, and they're going to reopen for 90 days and make healthcare available to a good chunk of Americans who are losing their health insurance.
Have money. It's not a free enterprise.
No, but with the signing of an executive order, you can make this available, and Americans can join the health exchanges
without money.
Well, they're still going to pay for Obamacare, but if they have low enough incomes, then they don't have to pay, and if their incomes are at a certain level, they're heavily subsidized.
Okay.
But the other thing I'd say about the initial list is, again, going back to Khalil's point, a lot of it's kind of rolling back. It's low-hanging fruit. It's rolling back the executive orders that Trump had issued in regard to climate change, in regard to immigration, in regard to the deferred action or DACA, kids. Those are the kinds of things that he did on day one. He also introduced a comprehensive immigration bill, which I was a little surprised to see on day one.
Which one is that?
Well, so that's not an executive order. That was actually introducing legislation.
Oh.
Or he proposed legislation, I should say. Only Congress members can introduce legislation, but he proposed an immigration bill, which was, to me, was really striking. And so you already see a handful of priorities. COVID being the top priority. What's that?
Introduce an immigration bill.
Yeah. So, well, again, so what he's doing is he's signaling his priorities. One is, addressing the COVID-19 pandemic aggressively. One is addressing the climate change aggressively. Another is dealing with the immigration issue head on, which, again, to me was really striking because it's a hot button issue, but it's also, a crucial issue to a pluralist society.
So, do you think in this, when I took immigration law, needless to say, I flunked. But despite that, I was overwhelmed by the statutes coming in every darn day. But on top of that, by us being, and correct me if I'm wrong, the only, or one of the only, a few countries where you get born here, you get to be a citizen. So do you think a trade-off is going to be in this new, whenever we get it, immigration bill, a DCing of that entity? They'll get born here.
Oh, I can't imagine that would, because that's in the Constitution, so I can't ever see that being overturned. But the one thing about the immigration bill that I think is interesting is, or important is that, you know, we are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural society. One of the reasons why there's a good chunk of America that's hostile to immigration is they see it as diluting, you know, the traditional white culture of the society.
Mm.
But the flip side is our population is actually in decline, and immigrants actually run the economy. I mean, they do a lot of the low-wage jobs, whether it's picking fruit or picking vegetables, you know, working in meatpacking plants, you know, working in every restaurant in Chicago and hotel. You know, if you didn't have this, you know, workforce, you know, America would be less profitable. And so there's a whole slice of the business community, and this is kind of the paradox of American society. You know, we desperately need immigrants to, you know, run the economy or to, you know, provide labor. But by the same token, we're worried about them, you know, changing the nature of our society. And you know, Trump was able to kind of play up on that in a way that I think was actually really detrimental.
Well, that brings forth a lot of questions. If, you know, it's like the masters and the slaves on the plantation. I'm going to run your butt to death, have you picking my vegetables, ironing my clothes, feed me my food, but I'm still running it.
But the one thing that, you know, that is in the Biden bill is a pathway to citizenship. And the idea is that
you become a citizen and you still are ironing my clothes, picking my vegetables, feeding me my food, and washing my darn toilet. What difference does it make?
Because your kids are going to go to college and they're going to be a university professor at DePaul. And
no, but that's true. And I think that perhaps that's not seen. But there's that other part of governance. Sovereign states, you guys have taught me, have to be able to protect from violent incursions from outside. They have to sometimes go to war, although we've seen to make that a part of our back pocket. But they have to do some other things. How are people whose allegiances lie elsewhere going to do that in a place where they receive their benefits?
Khalil, you want to take that one?
I want to be emphatic to our viewers that Professor McLeod did not fail immigration law. I happen to know that for a fact. That's number one. Number two, okay, then we have a point. No, that's a very good question that Ammon is asking, that our host is asking, and I think that it is an issue of allegiance, but it's also an let's back up a little bit, right? When we're talking about the post-slavery amendments, right? That's what allowed for Americans to be citizens if they're naturally born here, and that's precisely because, you know, the former enslaved folks that were being born cannot be created or treated citizenship at birth. That's unjust and unfair. But as an immigrant myself, I think it's a wonderful sort of strength of this country, this idea that if you're born here, you're a member, but to really belong, you have to participate. What that means is a different story, right? And I think that we have to be absolutely certain to emphasize, as academics, as activists, as scholars, as TV programming hosts, we have to be emphatic about the fact that this isn't, as some would like to portray it, a black or white issue or a white person's issue. The truth is there's a sort of a de-Americanization of America taking place, of which it's undeniable whiteness is a component, but it's not the only element of it. So for example, you know, gender and class and race, the gig economy, the dislocation economically that has happened, where, you know, this idea of being a university professor is now outmoded. This idea of being a full-time tenure track or tenured university professor is now this thing that's the luxury of a very, very, very shrinking few. It's always been a shrinking few, but not to the extent that if I quit this, then what, right? It's not to the extent that driving an Uber and teaching, adjuncting, etc., are two completely acceptable sort of things to do, or worlds that don't really collide at all. In fact, they fit. our public education, our public school teachers are working at gas stations. I think that it's more than just economics and skin color. I think it really goes, and really, as both of you are pointing out, I think it goes, if I can paraphrase it, to the soul of what this country is, what this country was, and what this country is becoming. Sorry to sound a bit weird, but it's true. It's about the soul of America.
Sounds like Joe Biden. No.
Amen.
So how successful? I mean, when I'm looking down this list, he has something on there about promote racial equity. How you do that?
Well, so he actually just rolled out an initiative that's headed up by Susan Rice, who's former national security advisor under Obama, and they've got a number of initiatives about that, and I can't say I know the initiatives inside and out, but they've made a commitment that the way in which they're going to purchase supplies for the federal government, the way they're going to hire. There's going to be, I don't want to say use the word affirmative action because it has a bad connotation to it, but they're going to be targeting minority businesses and ensuring equity in the way in which they disperse money and grants and what have you, and the way in which they engage in their hiring. And they've been walking the walk so far.
But isn't that going to antagonize the lower rung?
Well, that's
the election. Okay. Those people that are going to antagonize, they lost.
Yeah,
consequences.
So but Amina, that's a really important question. And I remember when Biden rolled out this immigration legislation in the opening days of the administration, that was one thing. That was one of my concerns. As I talk about a hot button issue, you're really poking the tiger here. But I think that at the end of the day, he's standing by what he ran on, and I think that at the end of the day, he's looking to a broader swath of the American electorate, and he's really genuinely trying to be inclusive and to follow through on what he campaigned on. The last thing I'll say is, if you look at his like $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, it's not just for Black people, it's not just for brown people, it's not just for white people. I mean, it targets all sectors of American society. And I think that, and it really is genuinely inclusive. And I think it kind of goes back to your earlier point that, if you're lifting up, the bottom rungs of American society, it helps everybody. It doesn't just help, white or Black or red or yellow or whatever.
We have a question that I think you can see on your screens from our listening audience. Either of you tackle it first.
So I think his agenda is feasible. I think that the real question that's at the heart of this is, will the institutions block his ability to enact his proposed agenda? And again, will it be more like the Obama era where the Senate, or Republican-controlled Senate, try to shut everything down from day one? And the jury's out. Jury's out. We'll wait and see. But I think it is a realistic agenda, and I think that if he can cobble together enough centrist Republicans in the Senate, particularly around a robust COVID relief bill, that would be a great first start.
Khalil?
I like the question, but I would take it even a step further. I mean, feasible is a nice word, but I would say necessary. How necessary is it? And I would say it's absolutely essential. Listen, Joe Biden is not Barack Obama. Barack Obama's figure was revolutionary in the history of the republic. Joe Biden is not revolutionary. Uncle Joe is Sleepy Joe. It's a late is over. He's a parliamentarian, right? And by political science standards, that's kind of tranquil and boring. And that's exactly what the Constitution called for: the domestic tranquility. With Donald Trump, we had domestic, I don't know what it is, like
anarchy.
Insanity, anarchy, whatever you want to call it. With this president, I think we begin to go back to tranquility. And I think that's absolutely essential for the health of the republic.
Yeah. And if I can elaborate on this for 1 second. Sure. In some respects, his ability to get stuff done in the long run is premised on the ability to get stuff done early on.
That's right.
And there's some of the stuff that's clearly within the purview of the administration. So even like his changes in the approach to the pandemic, I think are going to be transformative. And they were always in the realm of doable. I mean, they were always doable, always in the realm of possibility under the Trump administration. But the Trump administration they had no interest in actually having a federal role in addressing the pandemic. I mean, they just delegated everything to the states, whether it was the decisions on mask wearing and social distancing or distribution of vaccines. And I think what you've seen just in the last week and a half is a more conscious federal role in kind of getting the vaccines out. And if we can kind of reopen the country, that's going to be a first. That's going to give a huge amount of legitimacy to the Biden administration, and that will help them then push their their other agenda items down the road.
Well, I'm going to ask,
by the way,
one long kind of last question. How, from a political science and a sociological and a historical point of view, do you see a repair of the body politic?
Khalil, go ahead.
Wow. Listen, I mean, if I was asking that same question, Professor McLeod, in 1860, I would say that it would take the rupture of the Civil War. I hope that this was the rupture, that we have an insurrection and a march on Washington, right? A storming of the first branch of government, because the second branch has abnegated its duties to the American people, and yet egged them on to storm the first branch. Look, I think that the only way that we could heal the body politic is by listening to one another. I know that sounds weird. It's like, what's he talking about, listening to one another? Nobody's listening to anybody. I know. But we really do. We need to listen to one another. As Americans, I think we have that strength. And I think that we could see eye to eye. We all want the same thing. We all want to raise our children. We all want prosperity. We all want a peaceful country. We all want America, the America that I love America. I came to this country as an immigrant by choice. We didn't flee some war, right? We fled other things, but not war, right? I came to this country because it's the greatest country on earth, and it really still is the greatest country on earth. But what makes it our greatness is in our values, and our values are about dialogue. And I fear that given the echo chamber that you both are absolutely rightly and lovely way that you're presenting it, pointing out, I think that we're having a crisis and there has to be a rupture. Hopefully we've seen it, but I don't think this cat's gonna hide for much longer. I think it's gonna be around for a while. I don't think it's going back in the bag, and it, any metaphor, toothpaste back in the whatever, right? The point is that we're gonna have to put the genie back in the bottle. God, here I go again. What I'm saying is we have to do something to address the legitimate grievances that we have as Americans, starting with dislocation, in my humble opinion, professional opinion, and otherwise.
Yeah. So it's a tough question to answer. I mean, I've always argued that America's politics are more divisive than than American society. And I say this in part because I look at my own family, and I've got one set of cousins that are, I have one cousin who used to be on the board of Planned Parenthood in San Francisco, and I've got another cousin who's a Trump NRA card-carrying person up in West Michigan. And
true American family.
I was gonna say you should see our Thanksgivings, right? But the thing is, at the end of the day, we all love each other, and we all place the interest of our society and our family and our community ahead of of our politics. And I think that in an odd way, Joe Biden might be kind of the man of the hour, where he can speak to both sides because he's been around for such a long time. And that, if we can get away from the demonization, of the other side, that we can begin to, kind of, reconcile, or at least, find some kind of common ground. And this gets back to my larger, point earlier, is that I think that, if we can, because we have, not just the pandemic, but this major economic crisis. And if he can just peel off enough people of goodwill from the other side to support his agenda in the early stages, I think that's the beginning of, of a bit of a rapprochement. Now, let me make one last comment on all this. After the January 6th events, there was really interesting, debate in the newspapers and different journals. And there's this kind of an argument, like one side thought that January 6th is what broke the fever, that, clearly the right wing had gone too far. But the other side said, oh no, just you wait, there's now going to be a rallying cry. And I think that what you're seeing is that, that's playing out right now within the Republican Party. What was the lessons the Republican Party learned from this whole last 6 months, or last 6 weeks in particular, but last 6 months? Is it that they stood by Trump too long, or that they didn't stand by Trump in his time of need? And I think the Republican Party is going to need to sort that out, and we're going to see a really tumultuous time coming forward in the next 2 years. And,
on the website fujicate.com, they say Hardee's chocolate chip cookie, one fresh baked.
I don't know what that is.
Okay.
Well, I think we have lots to talk about. I think I'm going to spend a moment and try to divvy things up, because what I see is I'm signing up for both of your courses in the next 10 weeks. I see learning the basics of political science, but now I see that you've got to teach me something different. So I think I'm going to play student in class, chop divvy, and get all my questions lined up. I want to thank both of you. This end of Trump, beginning of Biden, and we're certainly going to have to plan to visit this after 100 days to see where we are. And I'm sure something's going to jump off in the middle of that. But I want to thank both of you. I know this is a very busy time of the year with students and families getting COVID, coming off COVID, re-registering and sorting all those things out. It has always, as usual, been a pleasure. This is Professor Amina Al-Deen with Professors Scott Hibbard and Khalil Marrar, and we're talking about one era ends, another begins. This is Critical Talk on Muslim Network TV. Again, thank you.